I've got a problem here. I've been working on this lesson for a while. I came up with an introduction, but then I don't like it. So I'm going to go from scratch and wing it. Just because that's what I do sometimes. Over the past few years, and I would even say well beyond the past few years, I've learned that prayer is a very powerful, challenging aspect of the Christian life. It's something that it's so easy to do at times, but yet can be so challenging, so difficult. And you would think we're just saying words. It should not be difficult. Why is it difficult? I mean, when everything's going fine, I can go out, I can say a prayer anytime before any meal and be fine with that. And that's easy enough to do. And it's so easy to put our hope and our faith in God when all things are going well. But when things get challenging, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And part of that is just human nature. It's just the way we are. We live in the now. We experience the now. We kind of look in our past for guidance for the future. But we really don't have much in the way of knowledge of the future. And things get challenging at times. And I think it's even more challenging that we serve a living God. He's a God that takes care of us, that looks after us, and is so much a part of our lives. And prayers are the way that we interact and express ourselves. But we also have to understand that our God is what I might term unpredictable. The things that we expect might happen are not always the way things turn out. The obvious solutions that we see are not the solutions that he sees. And it comes down to we just can't fathom his wisdom. We don't understand or comprehend the idea that he truly understands who we are in ways that we can't. We don't have a clue what's good for us until after the fact. And sometimes I think that short-sightedness on our part makes it difficult to truly understand what prayer is and how it works in our lives. And so this started from a friend of mine who I consider a friend at Harding, who had come to us while we were in Arkansas and preached. And he kind of got me started with this book that I went in and purchased because I thought it was a good book, and I have just begun scratching the surface of it, so I'm not even covering any of it. But there were several things that I thought were really important. I felt it was different. It was eye-opening. Because as I live my life, and as I have gone through different aspects of my life, some of it very easy, some of it very difficult, it helps me to understand what in the world am I facing? What am I trying to do? And how do I deal with these situations? And so as I went through and just started skimming and looking through some ideas and trying to understand what kind of a God do we have and, how predictable is he? I realized very quickly that you can't figure it out. I know in the past, Patrick's mentioned the number of times that old barren women suddenly have a child. They're 90 years old, 100 years old, doesn't make a difference. They end up with a child. Who could have expected that? Definitely not them. We hear of Sarah laughing. That's just part of it. It's not real. It's not possible. We look at Elijah when he's with the prophets of Baal and they're having this contest. And no matter what those prophets of Baal do, they've been praying and pleading with their God to set fire to this sacrifice that they have prepared, and yet nothing happens. Yet here's Elijah saying, basically, try harder. Maybe he's just not listening. Maybe he's gone out for a little bit, And when it's his turn, what does he say? Just dump a whole bunch of water. Let's make it so this thing can't burn. And yet, what happens? It immediately bursts into flame and everything is consumed. Who would have thought that was a possibility? In the fiery furnace, we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's no way that they're going to survive this. It's been ordered to be 7 times hotter than it ever was. And they're thrown in, but it's so hot that the people that throw them in are burned up. They should not be alive, but yet there they are. And not only are they there, there's a 4th person there. Like, who would have figured that? That defies all sorts of logic. We look at the lion's den when Daniel's thrown in there. And these are ferocious beasts who usually were starved, so that when people were thrown in, they were devoured because that was their source of food. But yet he's thrown in, and not only is thrown in, spends the night in there and is at peace with the lions. Yet as soon as he comes out, the people that had the charges thrown against them, they don't even reach the bottom of the pit before they're devoured. How can that happen? That is not normal. That is not something that we can address through logic. It doesn't make sense to us. We even look in the New Testament, just another instance where Peter is freed from the jail and he is led out and ends up at Mary's house. And you all know Rhoda goes to open the gate because someone's there and she can't believe it, so she leaves him hanging at the door. Goes running in to tell everyone, hey, he's here. He's not supposed to be. How? If someone tried escaping, they would immediately be put to death. It defies logic. That is who our God is. He is someone who defies logic, who defies capabilities. And yet, for some reason, when we try to approach him in prayer, we expect logical answers. But we also look at, there's some instances, some cases that prayers were made or things happen that defy logic, or do they? We look in Acts at the stoning of Stephen. Truly a man with God's heart, or they're solely dedicated to God, yet he is stoned to death. He prays to God. But is he saved? No, he perishes. We look at Paul, in just one instance. He's on a ship in a storm. They've been dealing with these stormy seas. And yet, he's told, don't worry, everyone will survive. The ship wrecks. No one perishes. It's not expected. But he was told it would happen. And in the situation, we look at Christ, when he's hanging up there on the cross, he has previously said, not my will, but yours. God could have easily said, okay, you've gone through enough. But he didn't. He let the actions take place and he perished on the cross. Why? There was every bit of power there, everything God could provide. He could have done anything. Like the song says, he could have sent 10,000 angels, but he didn't. So as I start looking at this, looking at the idea of prayer, it's like, okay, what do I expect from prayer? Because I can see anything happening. When you see that people are surviving from miraculous situations and other times dying for whatever reason, that seems natural and seems purely logical. Someone being stoned to death, that was commonplace as far as a form of execution, and you expected that to happen. That was very normal. And granted, not all those situations I've mentioned involve prayer, but I think what it does is it shows us what God is willing to do and shows some biblical outcomes of different situations that maybe make us think a little bit different about the way we see things or the way we understand the future and what is good for us. Uh, I think part of it also helps to demonstrate God's authority. We know He has complete control over life, death, but does He always use that? Does He always say, well, this is a good person, therefore I will always take care of him? And maybe not. Maybe that's not what we expect. And so when we pray, a couple thoughts I came up with was realistically, we have no power or no control over the outcome that God has decided should be the desired outcome for us. Yes, we have seen times in the Old Testament when there have been negotiations per se. When Abraham was trying to save Sodom and Gomorrah, we saw a discussion. Will it 50 people, or say, how about 10 or even 5? And God just went with it. But that's not normal. We don't have the normal discussions, those direct conversations with God like they did. And while I think it's important to recognize that we don't have control over the outcome, our trust impacts the acceptance of the outcome. If we trust God that the outcome will be what is needed, we have a much better acceptance of whatever that outcome may be. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we go through our prayer lives, as we ask for things, as we even give thanksgiving. We understand that in all that we do, we are providing feedback. We're providing our devotion. We are showing it to God. And so I really started looking at it. It's like, what exactly is prayer? How do we go about saying prayers? What do we do? And of course, the first thing I thought of was the couple of verses in Revelation, which described prayers as incense in both Revelation 5, verse 8, and chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. It basically says incense. It is the prayers of the saints. It is a pleasant scent to the Lord, to God. He appreciates those prayers. And if you look at it, even though they're very much appreciated, we see that Christ teaches prayer in the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to come back to this phrase. It's the only time in the Bible, really, that prayer is taught. If you never really thought about it, we're going to look into it a little bit more, but that particular section of the Sermon on the Mount is the only place that the way we are to pray is taught. But there's a specific reason for that. And that is in response to the religious leaders in their public prayers. And so I wanted to look back into it as I read that and started looking into, well, what about, the books of the Torah or the Pentateuch? Those are considered, a lot of times they're referred to as the books of law, but in reality, it's the books of instruction. These books cover all the aspects of the Israelites' life. It tells them how to dress. It tells them what to eat. It tells them how to work and when not to work. It tells them how to worship, how to sacrifice, when to sacrifice. It tells them everything. You ever notice it doesn't tell them how to pray? Why is that? And I think part of it is because there's a general idea that you cannot teach prayer. Yes, we can go up here and say, this is how you can pray, but it's really not a form of instruction. It's not learning something. Rather, prayer is something that must be practiced. Prayer is an exercise. And if you don't continue to exercise, you don't gain better at it. And I think this is really important as we start looking at some of these, that we don't always understand what prayer means. And we don't always understand that we don't have the right words all the time. And that's okay. I want to look at two very early examples of prayer. The first one's going to be in Genesis 20. Now, I will say, if you look up the word prayer or pray in a concordance, depending on your version, depends on how it is rendered, because a lot of times, particularly in the King James Version, when it says, I pray, it's sometimes as a way of begging, or I plead of you to do this, rather than an actual prayer to the Lord. So just throwing that out, this is the first use of the specific Hebrew word. I'm not going to go into it because I'm not very good at it, but I was looking at the actual Hebrews and just to see what the words are and exactly when they were used. And so what I'm looking at is in Genesis 20, we have the story of Abraham and Abimelech. Now, this is kind of the time when we've talked about this in the past, where Abraham kind of lied a little bit and said, hey, Sarah, just tell him you're my sister so we don't have problems later on. And it's kind of interesting because they've gone ahead and given this tale that she is not his wife. But it's interesting because in verse 3, it says, But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, She is my sister? And she herself said, He is my brother? In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I have done this. And God said to him in the dream, Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now, then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. So we're going to drop down a couple verses. Because here he's being given the command to go see him so he can actually pray for her. And if we drop down to 14, then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who you are with, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed up to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children, for the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And I think it's really interesting that this first example is not one of God's chosen people, but yet someone who is commanded to go to his prophet Abraham and be prayed for. And then he does that. He goes to him, presents the gifts, and all it says is Abraham prayed for him. It's our first example of a prayer being offered up to God on behalf of someone, yet there's not a single detail about it. There is nothing said about what that prayer was. What did that first prayer look like? There's nothing there. But we're going to switch over to chapter 24 now, and we have Isaac, this story of Isaac and Rebekah, and Abraham has just passed away, and Isaac is here, or correction, Abraham has not passed away, but he sends his servant out to get a wife for Isaac. And it's interesting, and depending on the version you read, depends on really how this will read. I'm going to start off in chapter 12, just to read a couple verses here. But basically, what's happened is the servant has gone to a land that is acceptable to God to find a proper wife. And he says in verse 12, he says, "And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, behold, I am standing by a spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I say, Please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, Drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one that you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." This is a prayer that the servant is offering up to God to help him in the selection process, because he's just been sent there and has no idea who in the world he's supposed to be looking for. He just knows he's supposed to get a wife. I probably would not be very good at that, because usually I have a bad habit of selecting not the best people. Sometimes it can be challenging. So when you're asked to go get someone a wife, yeah, that's a big responsibility. I'd be wanting some guidance. So he prays to God for this. So we have a whole situation come out where actually that is exactly what happens. The prayer is answered exactly as he states it. And if we drop down to verse 42 and a couple of verses there, it's after he has met the woman and has gone back to her house, to her father. And he is giving the explanation of what has just transpired and why he's even in this situation. And he says, "I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, Please give me a little water from your jar to drink. And who will say to me, Drink, and I will draw for your camels. Also, let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son." In verse 45, I think is really interesting. And he says, "Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar, and she went down to the spring, and that is filled." But I think it's really interesting that the first mention of it early on, he's saying this prayer to God before everyone gets there. But yet, here, as he retells the story, it's not an audible prayer. He's saying this prayer in his head. It's a silent prayer, a personal prayer for guidance. And I think that is so unique that basically in this situation, just a few verses or chapters after the first one, where we have someone being asked to go for the public prayers, that now we have a private prayer, one that is conducted in their head. And I think there's several considerations. One we have to make is, one, this was not a personal request. He's not requesting for himself. He is rather requesting this situation for his master. And if you read into the text, you will find that he's humbled before God. He bows down. He treats this whole situation with the full seriousness that it requires. And I think there's also an expectation that some kind of action is going to take place. He is going to have to do something. He's not going to be told, okay, go here, find a wife for me, and he's just going to stand around and wait for someone to show up suddenly, But he has to go to where they are. He prays to get the wisdom, to get the guidance to find that person. And as you go through the rest of the Old Testament, we see different variations. We see in one case, the first prayer, we just say, They prayed. We have a prayer this time that's very detailed. And as we continue through the Old Testament, as we look at different prayers, we tend to see a lot of the same. We see a lot of times where the men of God just say they prayed to God, or they prayed for this situation. But there's other times that we have very distinct wording with their prayers. And just a couple of them that I found was, like, for instance, in Psalm 17, this is a prayer to David. I'm not going to read this entire thing because I don't want to take up all my time reading this particular section. But as we look at Psalm 17, if you look at the heading, in the title part, it says, "In the shadow of your wings, a prayer of David." This is a prayer that he brings out, and just to kind of summarize it, he feels like he's being treated unjustly. He feels like he's being ostracized, and there's just so many things against him. And he's praying for this, that he can be found right in the eyes of God and men. And he asks for that support from God and for these wrongs to be righted. And I think it's a very good example of a prayer. It's 15 verses long, but it's extremely explicit into what he's asking. It's not just a matter of he prayed. It could have easily said he prayed, but here we have an example of what he prayed. But we also, I wanted to go ahead and look at a couple of these here. In the book of Jonah, we actually do have a couple of prayers I want to look at. And I'm going to go ahead and read both of these because, one, they're not terribly long, but I think it's interesting. In Jonah's case, his prayers are really interesting because the first one he makes is, at this point, unlike Paul, who was in the shipwreck, was in the storm that ended up in a shipwreck and everyone survived, he's on a ship that in a storm, and it's been decided that he is the one that's the cause of it. So instead of the ship wrecking and falling apart and everyone dying or whatever, they threw him overseas. All of a sudden the sea is calmed, but he's swallowed by a fish or a whale or whatever you want to call it. Not exactly the answer to a prayer I would want, but it's kind of interesting because it says in chapter 2, verse 1, "Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All of your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought me up from the life of the pit. O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayers came to you, into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Obviously, he was in a time of distress when he said this. I have never been swallowed by a fish, nor would I like to ever be swallowed by a fish, but I can't imagine it's very pleasant. So at this time, when he is in a very unpleasant situation, he is recognizing his wrong, and he is pleading to the Lord through this prayer. But yet, just a few verses later, in chapter 4, verses 2 through 4, I'll start at verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry, and he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? It's like a night and day difference between what he's pleading for on one side and asked for on the other hand just days later. Does he really know what's good for him, what he needs? And I think part of this is as we go through life, we don't always know what we need. As we move forward, we see what's in front of us, but we don't see what's beyond that. And I think part of our problem is that we are short-sighted. We're just human. We can't see beyond what we know. And yet God in his infinite wisdom provides us with guidance on it, on how to look ahead and to look at ourselves. And it's really interesting because we have to get all the way into the New Testament to the Sermon on the Mount before we get to learn about prayer, which I find it to be kind of intriguing because the Sermon on the Mount was not being presented to people that were very knowledgeable. They weren't the educated of the time. They were for the lay person. And he provided the guidance in the Sermon on the Mount with what they saw and experienced. And when you really look at it in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew chapter 6, it really starts in verse 1. He starts giving the reason why he provides this lesson on prayer. He said, because in verse 1, he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees it in secret will reward you. Now, it's kind of interesting because they kind of trace this back that prior to Babylon, there wasn't any real issues with the problems that they're facing now with the religious leaders. It's only after they left Babylon, as they started looking back at the book of law, as they considered it, as opposed to instruction, they began to take things much more literal. And so I'm just going to real quickly flip back to Deuteronomy 6 and just read kind of one of the phrase or one of the passages that they have they kind of corrupted in many ways. And yet, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the base of it and the gist of it. And I'm just going to read probably about the first 7, 8 verses. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, have promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you are in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts in your house and be on your gates. Now, when we read that, we understand what he's saying. In all that we do, in all that we see, in all of our actions, we are to keep these centered on our heart, and these actually dictate the way that we present ourselves to others. We keep these written on our heart, and our actions, our eyes, we see things in that way. But what has happened is, in the time after Babylon, they've gone back, the religious leaders, and have looked to take this much more literally. So all of a sudden they have these armbands and things above their eyes. I've saw some modern pictures of people that actually, some of the people in Israel that have boxes with these words, with the scriptures written on them on their forehead. It doesn't do much good, but they saw that as a way of doing it. And so what you saw was the religious leaders of the time began to make a big show. We do this, we do that. We've crossed these boxes. We've made sure that we're wearing what we're supposed to. And what's happened is that in the process of all this, that they have gotten away from what the words truly meant. And so when we read this section on the Lord's Prayer, we look at it in the light of Christ is comparing it to what the religious leaders of the time were doing versus what the intent was. And so back in Matthew in verse 5, and when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received your reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows all that you need before you ask him. Pray then like this. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as also we have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. What he is trying to do is trying to get us away from the physical actions that they were doing at the time to say, you need to get this back to your heart. This is where the prayers come from. They originate in your heart. And it is something between you and God. It's not for show. And it's so easy sometimes just to throw out words because they're there. And I'll admit I do that regularly because we get in these habits of saying words, particularly at meal times, because we're eating 2-3 times a day, depending on who you are. And we tend to say the same things over and over again. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think we're taking the time to acknowledge that what we have is from God, and we are so thankful in it. But it is easy to get into that repetition. And I think it's so important that we kind of look back at it as we need to focus on really what's in our heart, because again, this is a reflection of our relationship with God. If we always are repeating the same words back to the people we work with, they're going to get bored with us pretty quick. So we don't want to become boring with God. But I think as we continue through, as you go about your life, that you really think about the way that you pray and the reasons why you pray. Just in closing, I'm just gonna touch back on 4 different points. We have to understand that when we pray to God, we're praying to a living God who knows us better than we ever know ourselves. while the outcome may not be exactly what we want, it's probably what we need. Melissa and I have been saying this, a number of times in recent times. Sometimes we want a lot more than what we get, but we always tell ourselves, no, that's what we want, but God gives us what we need. We don't always get what we really want. And I think when he gives us that, he will answer our prayers in one way or another. And we may not understand it. It's like everyone says the phrase, hindsight is 2020. We never know what that prayer is going to look like when it's answered, when we pray ahead of time. We don't always know what the answer looks like when it's right there in front of us. But you know what? We tend to find the answer that is what we needed. And I think it's also very important to keep in mind that our trust in God is really what accepts the outcome, whether it's good or bad. We don't know what the answer to our prayer may be, but when our trust is fully in God and we can accept that whatever happens, we accept it knowing that God has provided what is best, we will later at some point fully understand why it was best. We may not understand now, but it helps us to accept the situation as it is. It doesn't mean it's always going to be pleasant, but it is acceptable. And I think as a final note to close is prayer is all about the heart. It's about us communicating to God through our heart what's truly inside of us and letting him know what's there, whether it's thanksgiving, whether it's asking for guidance, whether it's asking for help because we're in a situation that's going downhill. We just can't see the end of it. We just have to understand that as long as it's heartfelt and we're directing to the right person, directing it to God, he will answer that prayer in one way or another. So if there's anything we can do for you, whether it's prayers or anything else, please come forward as we stand and sing.